incarcerations. There is some evidence that in the United States, drug incarcerations affect poor and people of color to a greater magnitude than wealthier, whiter groups. So I guess I'm trying to get at the cause of that sort of statistic. And I guess the most conventional answer to the question as to whether the poor and people of color experience greater drug incarceration rates is, well, they use more drugs. I investigated that. I broke it down into two questions. Do the poor use more drugs than groups that are more well off? And do racial minorities use more drugs than whites? So for this one, we used a data set called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. In order to answer the question of whether some groups use drugs more than others, you have to break it down into specific drug types. That's how the analysis is best constructed. So I broke it down into 6 different drug types. In this particular figure, there are 6 different drug types shown. And in these, a very similar set, but slightly less. So I looked at uses of marijuana, alcohol, cocaine, hallucinogens, tobacco, and amphetamines. And so this color here, this is a group below the poverty line. The yellow is very much above the poverty line, and then the sort of earthy green there is the group sort of the median level. And it's clear from the statistics that there really is no clear pattern as to whether the poor use more drugs. Only in one category do they substantially use more drugs, but that's only in the tobacco dimension, and tobacco isn't even a criminalized drug. So it doesn't say whether or not they have a propensity to use more, to use criminal drugs more by the simple fact that they use tobacco more. So one of the limitations that has to be taken into account with this one too is that when you're looking at relationships between poverty line and like whatever variable, whatever drug use, as it was in this case, you find that oftentimes the poverty line is drawn too high or it's drawn arbitrarily. So even if the poor do use drugs in some dimensions slightly more, we would have to compare the poor in this set to the poor in another set to determine whether or not one trend holds true among the poor in general. And then, sort of to go through this a bit quicker, do racial minorities use more drugs than whites? I compared drug use rate in the past month among blacks aged 18 to 25, the same variables among whites. So as we can see here, hallucinogens and cocaine are used almost 0. Marijuana is used in recent years slightly more with blacks, but not significantly. Tobacco use is higher than whites, and alcohol use is substantially higher than whites. So in any case, all of this sort of refutes or tends to go against the idea that poor minorities use more drugs. This graph here represents relative rates of incarceration for drug offenses according to race. And for this, what we did is we used Census Bureau data as well as reports from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. We calculated what the percentage, what is the total number of each race population in using drugs, and then we calculated that as a percentage of each population group. That gave us relative rates of incarceration, and as you can see, blacks experience much more incarceration than whites. This may seem like a small difference, but they reflect very different ground conditions. And so my explanation for why that might be the case, there are 3 potential explanations. The one is it's possible that police are targeting poor communities and communities of color. I didn't find that a very good explanation because part of the nature of being a police officer is that you respond to all threats, all reported threats, not merely to some, not merely to threats localized in specific communities or areas. Another explanation as to why minorities are sort of get the short end of the stick in terms of drug incarcerations is because of systemic racism. That might be true, but the explanation I ultimately settled for is backed by way more evidence than sort of the speculative claims. And so because of the fact that public defender offices and public legal defense is underfunded, what happens is poor people and people of color get sort of shoddy, underfunded, understaffed public defenders, and instead of attorneys that can actually help them in a legitimate way. So that's why you see higher rates of drug incarcerations among the poor and people of color, because they can't afford adequate counsel. And then very quickly, the policy propositions for California. we would suggest that we increase public defender services. Um, and it may even be useful as well to decriminalize certain drugs, but you can still regulate them even if you do decriminalize them. And then the big thing is that the data on actual drug use shows that drug laws don't actually curb drug use. So a much better approach is to rehabilitate, not to punish addiction, and to approach it in a much more compassionate way. So that's it. That's my perspective.